How do we know Christianity is true? Here's a big reason. Christianity became the dominant global religion. But don't check out on me just yet. I'm not at all saying that Christianity is true just because it's popular. Hang with me, I promise this gets interesting. Let's think about it. Until 313 AD, Christians were persecuted underdogs. People were lit on fire, thrown to wild animals, crucified, you name it, just for following Jesus. The idea that Christianity would rise to become a worldwide movement? Practically zero, and yet, here we are. Well, why is that? Because Christianity's global spread was actually prophesied thousands of years ago in the Bible. Yes, this wasn't just a lucky rise to fame. It's right there in the Old Testament. Check out Isaiah 49, 6-7, where God tells his servant, "I will make you a light to the nations, that my salvation may reach the ends of the earth. Kings will stand up to honor you. Princes will bow low because the Lord has chosen you." Now, be real with me. Does anyone else in Jewish history fit that particular description besides Jesus? He's the only one who claimed to be the Messiah and founded a worldwide religion that includes billions of Gentiles, including kings and rulers. No other Israelite even comes close to that kind of global influence. To appreciate just how astounding this is, realize that before Jesus, monotheism was a niche market. Mostly Jews practiced it, and their scriptures were hardly on anyone's radar outside of their own communities. The Gentile world, pretty much polytheistic with some morally questionable gods. Most Jews back then weren't all that keen on sharing their faith, and very few Gentiles were interested. Fast forward to today, and suddenly 2.4 billion people, primarily non-Jews, are worshiping the God of Israel. But that's not all. Islam, with its 1.9 billion followers, is basically just a heretical offshoot of Christianity. You do the math. About half of the world now recognizes the God of Abraham, at least in some sense, and around a third of the world believes that Jesus is the Messiah. From a small persecuted group in a backwater Roman province to that. And Jesus straight up called it. He said, "This gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the world as a testimony to all nations." So what exactly are the odds of this happening? Well, less than 2% of the world's population today is Jewish. Back in Jesus' time, it wasn't much higher. The chances of a Jewish Messiah starting the world's largest religion? Astronomically low. And how many famous Jews were despised and rejected by their own people, as Isaiah said? And yet, here's Jesus, not only rejected by his own, but also establishing a movement that flipped the world upside down. In fact, the Jewish rejection of Jesus, one of the most favored objections of the rabbis and skeptics, actually supports his messiahship. Isaiah predicted Israel would turn its back on the Messiah. The global spread of Christianity, despite all odds, isn't just impressive, it's straight up prophetic proof. And that gives us good reason to trust in both Jesus' messiahship and the divine inspiration of the Bible. Now, at this point, some skeptics and rabbinic Jews might jump in here with the classic objection. But wait, the servant in Isaiah is often identified with Israel as a whole, so how can this be about Jesus? They'll cite passages like Isaiah 41:8, 44:1, and 49:3, where Israel is directly called the servant. So they argue Isaiah couldn't possibly be talking about Jesus. But actually, there are plenty of passages where the servant is clearly not Israel as a nation. Take Isaiah 49:5, which says, "And now the Lord says, who formed me in the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob back to him, and that Israel might be gathered to him." Now, wait a second, what? The servant is tasked with regathering Israel. How can Israel gather Israel? That logic just doesn't track. Clearly, in this case, the servant is an individual, not the nation as a whole. And then there's the bombshell in Isaiah 53, that very famous suffering servant passage. In verse 8, Isaiah writes, "For he was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people." How could Israel both suffer innocently and be punished for Israel's sins at the same time? If the servant is supposed to be the nation, this becomes a tangled mess of contradictions. The most logical explanation, one that many biblical scholars have pointed out, is that while Israel was called to fulfill a mission, it's an individual Israelite, Jesus, who actually carries it out. Now, some will argue that the servant is a personification of Israel, like an allegory of a righteous remnant, or some kind of ideal Israel. But that doesn't hold up either. In Isaiah 53:3, the servant is described as a man, not an abstract concept. He's got a soul, and he experiences the grave and death. If this were some kind of collective allegory, these words wouldn't make a lick of sense. We're talking about an individual, not a metaphor. So there you have it. Against all odds, Isaiah's prophecies of the servant bringing salvation to all nations were fulfilled. Jesus, once despised, brought the world to worship Israel's God. Thanks to the Dead Sea Scrolls, we know these texts weren't altered by later Christians, and even in New Testament times, they were very far from being fulfilled. Yet here we are with living proof of their truth.